Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on building a culture of feedback for English 1 through 4. My name is Casey Prince Harvey, and I work in the Office of Assessment Standards at the South Carolina Department of Education, and I will be walking you through today's slides. A little bit of housekeeping to get us started. First, there is a note catcher that you will be receiving as part of today's session. It will either be emailed to you if you were signed up to attend the session, or you can find it on the tiny URL that is on the slide that is on the screen right now. That will serve also as your resource landing page. So as we talk about resources in today's session, you'll want to access that note catcher in order to get to those resources, and there will be places for you to jot down your thinking throughout the webinar. Additionally, instructional resources and supports will be shared throughout the presentation and on your note catcher. But as a reminder, the resources shared in this presentation are just some of many examples. Curriculum is determined and selected at the local level, and instruction should be based on student interest and need. So in addition to what is shared today, please be sure to consult your high-quality instructional materials for resources and engagements to support student learning. Let's go ahead and start with today's purpose. Our purpose for today is to understand the importance of and expectations for feedback for English 1 through 4 and explore evidence-based practices for incorporating feedback into current instructional practices to support student learning and mastery. You see on this slide, there is a number at the bottom of the screen. That's number 1. That corresponds to box 1 in your note catcher. So as we look at the purpose statement for today, you can see that it is full of educator lingo. Take a moment in box 1 of your note catcher to deconstruct the statement. What are the verbs? What are the nouns? And in your own words, what do you think you should be able to do when we're finished today? As you transition from box 1 of your note catcher, we're going to do a little bit of a consider this. So on this slide, you see a variety of images that may be familiar to you. I want you to reflect on your thoughts, feelings, or memories that come to mind when you see these images. How do you relate to these images as a teacher? And how do you relate to them as a student? So often, we think of feedback at the high school level as something like this: the paper with the red pen edits. These images can often evoke feelings of anxiety, criticism, and exhaustion, especially if you're the teacher who's giving those edits in the red pen when you have 100+ essays to grade. During today's session, we want to shift our vision of feedback from being less about the red pen image, like we see on the left, to being more about the images that we see on the right. Additionally, throughout today's session, I'll be referencing information from 2 main texts, which I have included on the screen. So as we dive into feedback and strategies for giving and receiving effective feedback, you will see references to these 2 texts. So we are going to explore feedback through the agenda that we have on the screen, starting with laying the foundation for feedback. In other words, giving us the why, discussing norms for feedback, the what, when, and where, determining feedback and audience, in other words, the who, and lastly, exploring feedback conferences, which would be the how. Then we'll wrap up with clarity and closure. In box 2 of your note catcher, you will see that there is a document that has 2 articles on feedback. So the first thing that we'll do to lay the foundation on feedback is to have you read those articles And then on your note catcher in box 2, we want you to choose one statement from those articles that you feel is particularly impactful. Then we want you to reflect on your statement. You could make a connection, you could ask a question, you could pull out a statement that you might challenge from the article, or even select an aha moment, and then explain your thinking. Give you just a moment to do that. So some of our findings from the article or set of articles is that first off, feedback is essential for learning. Additionally, students need opportunities to apply feedback. So not just to receive the feedback, but then also to apply the feedback to improve their work. The article also shares different types of feedback that serve different purposes. So not all feedback is going to serve the best purpose in different scenarios. And then lastly, the articles discuss effect sizes, which we'll dig into in just a little bit. So what is feedback? Box 3 of your note catcher is going to have a space for you to take notes on feedback as we discuss the next few slides. So we want to start with a common definition. Here we have the definition from Hattie and Clark, that feedback is information about the task that fills a gap between what is understood and what is aimed to be understood. So let's review the language of this definition. What words or phrases draw your attention? Does this definition align to how we see feedback taking place in the high school ELA classroom? So this quote is from John Hattie, and that takes us back to that idea of effect sizes and visible learning. So I want to dig into that a little bit for anyone who needs a little bit of background. So John Hattie is known for his extensive work in evaluating the effectiveness of teaching strategies and other factors that influence student achievement. He's most renowned for his development of the concept of visible learning. So visible learning is a comprehensive synthesis of nearly 1,200 meta-analyses on student achievement. John Hattie compiled this research to determine which instructional strategies have the most significant impact on student learning. He introduced the concept of effect size to measure the influence of different factors on learning outcomes. Effect size is a statistical measure that indicates the strength of the relationship between a factor and student achievement. So when we talk about effect size, Hattie uses a benchmark of 0.40 as the average effect size, which he refers to as the hinge point, equivalent to an average year of growth. So strategies with effect sizes above 0.40 are considered to have a significant impact on and can potentially accelerate student learning. You can see a visual representation of this idea on this slide. So the image that you see on the slide is Hattie's barometer of influence. So ranging from negative impacts all the way to impacts that are at 0.4 or above. So according to the research of John Hattie, feedback has an effect size of 0.70, meaning that it can significantly enhance student learning outcomes and falls within the top 10 most effective teaching strategies. However, it's important to understand what makes feedback effective, how it should be given and received, and how these things support learning within the ELA classroom. So it's not enough for us just to say that feedback has an effect size of 0.70. We also need to hone in on what that looks like and what it means specifically to high school ELA. So we talked a little bit about Hattie, but we want to also dig into the idea of evidence-based practice. So feedback is an evidence-based practice. But in order to understand that, we want to make sure that we differentiate between an evidence-based practice and a research-based practice. Both of these terms are often used when discussing education and discussing teaching practices. So just to clarify, we do have in box 4 of your note catcher an article on evidence-based versus research-based practices. You'll also see that there is a spot on your note catcher in box 4 to jog your memory about these two terms. So starting with the J to read and review the resources provided, and then jot down important ideas and new learning. For the O, you're going to consider, based on your review of the material, offer one way that you incorporate evidence-based practices into your work already. And then for G, reflect on how you can apply any new learning from this section in order to grow as an educator. Take just a moment to do that. So our findings from the article for research-based practices, research-based is based on theoretical and initial research findings. It's supported by initial research and theory, but may not yet be widely tested or proven in diverse practical applications. And it may still be in experimental stages or early implementation phases. Whereas evidence-based practices are based on empirical evidence demonstrating effectiveness in real-world settings. They're supported by extensive, high-quality empirical research showing consistent, positive outcomes, and they're widely implemented and proven effective in various educational settings. So because feedback has such a high effect size and is a practice supported by evidence, we want to focus in on how we might use this practice to positively impact ELA instruction and learning for students. So this is laying that foundation and setting some groundwork up for why feedback should be an essential component of the high school ELA classroom. Not only is feedback an evidence-based practice, but it is integral to meeting the expectations of the profile of the South Carolina graduate. So even if it isn't directly stated, feedback certainly influences the knowledge, skills, and characteristics of the profile. So let's take a look. I want you to consider the profile. Think about how feedback might influence the knowledge, skills, and characteristics of the profile. A few findings that we have when we break down the knowledge, skills, and characteristics of the profile is that rigorous standards for any of our content areas are going to require that students give and receive feedback. In terms of skills, feedback will support critical thinking and problem solving, collaboration and teamwork, and knowing how to learn. And life and career characteristics of self-direction, perseverance, and work ethic are all supported by or support feedback. Additionally, feedback is interwoven throughout the new ELA standards. So our 2024 ELA standards, we see here our 4 strands: foundations of literacy, applications of reading, research, and written and oral communications. And you're going to have a chance to explore some of the ways in which feedback appears or is supported for learning within those ELA standards. And we're going to do that through something called the SAW method, which will be in box 5 of your note catcher. So this will be an independent exploration. In box 5 of your note catcher, you're going to see that you have a variety of vertical progressions for our ELA standards. So you might see some communication standards, you might see the overarching expectations, and what you're going to do is select one of those vertical progressions to do a deep dive into. And for that, you're going to skim and scan that vertical progression on your note catcher. You're going to annotate by noting big ideas and new learning, and then practice wondering by using the guided questions that are in box 5 of your note catcher. So take a moment to select which vertical progression you want to look at and complete the SAW method that is in box 5. So a couple of examples that I've pulled from the note catcher. When we see Communication 5, that's our standard for improving writing, particularly at the high school level, it specifically mentions considering feedback from peers and adults and using that to revise and enhance student work. So it is a specific expectation within the standards that students consider feedback from both peers and adults. We can also see feedback being an important component of the overarching expectations, even if it isn't specifically mentioned within the language. For example, students reading and writing for a variety of purposes, including academic and personal for extended periods. There may be a component of feedback included there, as well as acquiring, refining, and sharing knowledge through a variety of multimedia literacies. Anytime that students have to collaborate with others, there is the potential for giving and receiving of feedback. Students creating that quality work may require feedback in whatever way that work needs to look. Citing evidence to explain and justify reasoning. And then, of course, making inferences to support the comprehension of the text students are interacting with. We even see within our high school standards for oral communications, when students are collaborating with others, that not only will they have to ask relevant questions, but also build on and clarify ideas. They may need to modify personal ideas through feedback, and then consider those new ideas and perspectives. So each of those incorporates some level of feedback from others. One other piece that you may notice when reviewing our ELA standards across the board are these terms evaluate and critique. So as we move up those vertical progressions, in many places, you will see evaluate and critique as the highest levels of cognitive complexity within our standards. So how does feedback relate to these skills? Well, let's take a look at the definitions for evaluate and critique. If we want students to be able to effectively evaluate and critique information, they need ample experience with both giving and receiving feedback in a variety of scenarios with a variety of content. So not only is feedback supported through specific indicators or referenced in indicators, but when we look at the cognitive complexity of our standards, we see that feedback is an essential component of those as well. We'll close out this section with a quick reflection on what is one piece of information from this section that you would take back to your school or district and share. So as we have laid the foundation for feedback, what is one thing that you might take back to your school or district to share that you feel is particularly impactful? So we just discussed the why of feedback. We have the solid foundation of feedback, its importance, and its connection to the standards. So now we're going to explore how we can create positive and effective habits for feedback in the classroom. So we talked about the definition of feedback according to John Hattie, and we talked a little bit about visible learning, but now I want to lean back into that with a quote from Johnson from the text flash feedback. He says, according to John Hattie, ineffective feedback exists on a massive scale, with 32% of feedback having a negative effect, meaning that it actually hurts student growth. So just because we say we give feedback doesn't mean that the feedback is effective or promotes student growth. In order to build a culture of effective feedback, we need positive norms, and that's what we're going to discuss in this section. So when we talk about building a culture of feedback and effective feedback, there are 3 norms that we will explore. First is that feedback is formative. Lastly, feedback is best when there is a feed up and a feed forward. We're going to dig into each of these norms separately. Starting with norm number 1, feedback is formative. So think back to the images that we discussed at the beginning of today's session, that red pen. So the red pen typically comes out when work has already been created or drafted. We typically get that draft of student work, we take out that pen and we start circling all of the things that need to be fixed or things that need to be adjusted. And often we find patterns of issues or needs within these drafts, leading to repeated comments, frustration, and reteaching. I found myself in similar situations when I was teaching high school English, where I was leaving the same comment over and over and over again across student work, and wishing that I had addressed whatever that issue was earlier on. So, what if we could shift the feedback into those formative stages of the process of creating student work and negate the need for that red pen further down the road? Um, So let's consider the image on the right, which I will be sure to include on the note catcher as well. So this is an example of student brainstorming of prompts ahead of the actual drafting of the student work. So in this example, we begin with a topic and purpose for student work provided by the teacher. And from there, students are able to brainstorm multiple prompt options that they could explore from the teacher provided criteria. So in this example, we are providing a topic and a purpose for the student work, and the student will provide the mode of writing, the genre, and the audience for the work that they're creating. From there, they go through 2 rounds of feedback. So as they've brainstormed their writing prompts, they will receive feedback from peers and from their teacher before revising their prompt and moving towards selecting one of those prompts to draft. So I want you to consider, how might providing formative feedback this early in the writing process help to mitigate some of the issues that you may encounter when the red pen comes out? So if the student is having to intentionally brainstorm their mode of writing, their genre, and their audience, and then receive targeted feedback from that brainstorm, can it help to ensure that the focus of the writing is clear, that the tone is appropriate for the audience, before we have to take out that red pen and give those same pieces of feedback over and over again? Another option for providing that formative feedback is to do a whole class review. So this provides an opportunity to address those common needs or issues with student work early on, and it uses models to target those needs. So this helps to prevent the need to give the same feedback over and over again once you get towards the end of the work production cycle. So whatever the student work is, in this case, we have a process of observe, identify, and address. So starting with observe, we observe during the early stages of the student work to see if there are specific patterns or areas of confusion. We identify the patterns or those common errors, and then we address needs using models that align with whatever those needs are. So we provide a sample or a model for students to explore so that we can address whatever that point of confusion or point for clarity may be. Our second norm is that feedback is fast, and you may have heard this term before. It is one that we have referenced in the past. We like to think of feedback, effective feedback, as being fast, FAST, meaning that it is frequent. In other words, is feedback based on needs, and is this an ongoing practice? Is this something that is consistent across the class? A, as in actionable. In other words, can the feedback be realistically implemented? S, for specific. So does the feedback provide clear next steps? Is there something that I can do with this? And then lastly, T, for timely. Is the feedback relevant to the timeline, the stage of the process, etc.? This goes back to what we said previously with feedback being formative. It's much easier to give that feedback early on to mitigate any issues, as opposed to then coming in at the end stage and having to start from scratch. So I want us to look at some examples of feedback, starting with the feedback on the left. This may be an example of feedback that you have commonly seen, or in some cases even given for student work. And on its own, it isn't bad necessarily. However, does it give us what we need to make the work better? I think from a student perspective, if I did receive this feedback, I wouldn't know exactly where I needed to go with this, what information might be the most helpful, or even when the expectation is for me to have made those adjustments. So now let's see an additional example on the right. This is the revised version of the feedback that's on the left, and it uses portions of the FAST model. So we're being specific about the area in which students should be looking for their adjustment. We're also referencing the information that students could refer to. And it is timely and actionable with a specific time by which the student should go back to revise the work and what our plans are for us to look at it together. So if you are receiving the feedback that was on the right, how might you feel or how might you respond compared to the feedback that's on the left? Lastly, feedback is best when there's a feed up and a feed forward. So essentially what feed up and feed forward mean are that students need to have an active role in the feedback process. They should be reflecting on their own work and taking ownership of their next steps as opposed to being passive participants. So we're going to look at this norm through the example of writing conferences, which may be a typical practice in your classroom already or the classrooms of those whom you support. So let's start with feed up. So the feed up is the student's focus for feedback or the ask that they should come to the table with. In other words, when we are providing feedback for students, they should have already reviewed their own work and identified the important components of the work that they wish to convey. Additionally, they should be thinking about how they could improve their work through the targeted feedback. So when we look at the example on the screen, we see a portion of what you might consider to be a pre-conference form that a student might complete before taking part in a feedback session. So it is asking them to reflect back on their work, as well as to think about how they might make those improvements based on what they already have. So they're coming to whatever that conference is with a goal in mind. So while the example that I have here on the screen provides numbered questions, this example could also be turned into a graphic organizer or some other sort of format. The questions could be adapted based on the work that is going to be reviewed and who's reviewing it. So this is just providing one example of many. So that's our feed up. The student reflecting, focusing on their feedback, and providing the ask for what they should be improving. We also have a feed forward. So the feed forward is a student-created goal and actionable next steps based on the feedback they've received. So if one of our norms is that the feedback we give should be actionable, that only works if the students have action steps planned. So once students share their feedback or share their feed up and we give the feedback, they should think about how to apply the feedback moving forward. So we see here again on the screen the example of a writing conference, but this time it is a post-conference reflection. So as with the previous slide, these questions could be adjusted into a graphic organizer. They could be altered into another structure like a new, now, next, but the overall point here is the same. They are reflecting then back on the feedback that they have received. They're considering what feedback was the most helpful, and they are giving examples of the actionable next steps they could take to apply that feedback. So again, feedback is best when there is a feed up, so the students identifying their areas for improvement, and then a feed forward, which is them considering their actionable next steps for making those improvements once they've received the feedback. Altogether, this goes back to the idea of students being active participants in the feedback process. So now you have an opportunity to apply your learning around the 3 feedback norms using some scenarios. And these are going to be in box 7 of your note catcher. So what that's going to look like is you will have a variety of scenarios that you can look at. With that scenario, there will be a specific norm that will best apply. So you'll read the scenario, you'll highlight which of the 3 norms would best apply, and then I want you to brainstorm how you might respond to support the teacher based on what you know about the situation and the norms. So we see the example here of the scenario that students in Ms. Jimenez's class are working in groups to create a presentation about a topic of their choice. She wants the students to regularly provide feedback to each other to ensure their work is high quality and meets the presentation requirements. While observing the feedback sessions, she consistently hears feedback such as, "It looks okay," "You should probably just start over," and "I like the colors." So with those 3 norms that are in the bottom left corner, which one would most apply? And if you were coaching Ms. Jimenez, what response or what suggestions would you give her to support whatever that norm is? All right, we're going to move on to feedback and audience, which is the who. And again, looking back at that vertical progression for C5, we see specifically the mention of considering feedback, but I want to dig in here about the next component of those indicators, which is that students are considering feedback from both adults and peers. So we're not only considering the feedback from the teacher, but we are considering feedback from adults and peers in general. And if we're receiving feedback from peers, that means that students also need experience with giving feedback to one another. So who might be considered an adult or a peer within the language of that indicator? So when we're building a culture of feedback, who might fall within those 2 categories? Well, with adults, obviously the teacher could be the adult that's giving their feedback, could also be other school staff, parents, business owners, community members. So there are a wide variety of opportunities for students to receive feedback from adults. And really, it's going to depend on the context of the work. So what students are being expected to accomplish through their work. Some adults may be better suited for whatever that work is. For peers, the feedback could be given by classmates, but it could also be friends, community members who are of the same age, or even global peers of the same age, where students may utilize technology or communication methods to receive feedback from others who may have a different perspective or different experience from them. So the context, again, is going to determine which of these columns would most apply, and even within that, which option would best apply. So when might the teacher need to give feedback versus a global peer? Additionally, there are opportunities where an adult is going to be the best person to give feedback, or when a peer is going to be the best person to give feedback. So let's talk about when each of those might apply. Feedback from adults would be best in a structured setting when the feedback needs to be structured. When we are focused on the objective and the learning goals that are specific to the task. specifically with teachers when there is clarity on academic standards. So when we are really trying to focus in on the content, and when we are evaluating based on the assignment requirements. However, peers are a great option to give feedback in an informal setting when the work is more subjective or opinion-based. When the feedback is based on shared experiences and perspective. So maybe we want to get the teen perspective on a piece of work. So maybe they are the target audience, someone of a similar age, and so they want to get feedback based on that perspective. And when brainstorming and forming ideas. So whereas adults may be, in some cases, more appropriate when evaluating the work at the end of the product, peers would be a great option when brainstorming and forming those ideas in the initial stages. So you will see on box 8 of your note catcher that you have some resources that have been curated for feedback that you will have an opportunity to explore. And you'll also see that there is a USA reflection in that same box. So as you review those resources at your pace, I ask that you reflect on which of those resources you might be able to immediately use in your planning and instruction. In other words, it immediately is applicable to your work. You would not need to make any sort of major adjustments, that you could just take that and immediately incorporate it into your current work. What resource could you potentially share with a colleague? So it may not apply to your work necessarily, but maybe you have a colleague down the hall who you know might benefit from seeing that resource. Lastly, for A, what resource could you adapt to align with your grade level or instruction? So maybe you see a resource in that feedback folder that looks great, but might need to be adjusted slightly to meet the needs of your students, your classroom, or your context. So which one might you need to adjust? So take your time in box 8 to review those resources and reflect on what you might use, share, or adapt from those resources. Wrapping up here with exploring feedback conferences, we've looked at the why, the where, the what, the when, the who, and now we're going to look at the how. So again, going back to that definition of feedback from Hattie and Clark, that feedback is information about the task that fills a gap between what is understood and what is aimed to be understood. We're going to add to that by considering something called a feedback conference. So a feedback conference is just an opportunity to provide feedback and allow for students to plan actionable next steps. And a feedback conference can look a variety of ways. There's no one right way that a feedback conference needs to look. But why does it matter that we have an opportunity for a feedback conference? Well, while we talked about the effect size of feedback according to John Hattie's work, which is a 0.7, feedback conferences provide an opportunity to incorporate additional factors also with high effect sizes. So feedback has an effect size of 0.7, but if we're taking part in a feedback conference, that means that we're also building teacher-student relationships, which has an effect size of 0.72. Students have an opportunity for evaluation and reflection, which has an effect size of 0.75. And there's scaffolding that's provided through those feedback conferences based on the context and based on how the teacher provides that scaffolding and structure. And that has an effect size of 0.82. So we're compounding a lot of these high effect sizes through those feedback conferences. If you have attended our previous sessions, you know that we like to present learning experiences in the form of micros, minis, and macros. So that is learning experiences that range in complexity, length, and depth. So micro experiences being things that are less than one class period, mini experiences being 1 to 2 class periods, and macro experiences being those culminating experiences. So while some indicators can be explored through a micro experience, for example, we might bundle multiple indicators that could be explored in a culminating experience, which would be a macro. So I'm giving you that background because today we are adding to this by discussing the idea of the micro, mini, and macro feedback conferences. So a micro feedback conference might be a feedback session that is 1 to 2 minutes, a mini feedback session being 3 to 5 minutes, and a macro feedback session being 6 or more minutes. So I know we typically think of conferences as being a much longer, more structured experience. And you will see that there is an example in your feedback folder of a macro feedback conference. But your task today is going to be to use everything that you've learned in today's session to consider how you might create and use micro or mini conferences to support student learning. So for this section, in box 9 of your note catcher, you will see that you're going to be asked to review the conference example that's in the feedback resources folder. I then want you to review and think back on the feedback norms that were shared during this session. And then from there, brainstorm what a micro or mini feedback conference might look like. So if we were to scale some of that back to a micro or mini format, what might that look like? So once you've done that, your next step would be to choose a resource or strategy from the micro, mini, and macro master list, which is also included in your resources, and consider how it could be enhanced with your micro or mini feedback conference. For example, I went onto the micro, mini, macro master list and I pulled the English 3 micro experience for targeted rewrites. So let's say that in this example, a student creates a claim. And using the strategies and descriptors provided, they identify which area for revision they would most benefit from for revising just their claim. Then what I would build into that would be a 1-minute RAC micro conference. RAC standing for respond, add, and connect. So the way that we would do this is students would have 30 seconds to share their area for revision with the teacher. The teacher then has 30 seconds to add their feedback based on what the student shared. And then the student will close out by connecting the feedback to their next steps to revise their claim. So this is something that could be done very early in a writing process for students that could be formative and mitigate some of those issues that a teacher may see later on in the drafting process. And it's something that's quick and easy. Oftentimes when we think of those macro feedback conferences, particularly for writing, they tend to be quite lengthy, and it can be difficult to have those feedback conferences take place all within one class, and especially when you have 30 or more students all in the class at one time. So these micro and mini conferences allow those feedback opportunities in bite-sized portions. All right, wrapping up with our clarity and closure. I'm going to revisit our purpose for today. And you should see in box 1 of your note catcher, you wrote down what you thought you might be able to do by the end of this session. So I want you to consider how we met today's purpose, and did your interpretation of the purpose match the end result? For a closing reflection, I'll ask that you look at box 10 of your note catcher where you'll see triangle, circle, square. And for this reflection, just want you to jot down what are 3 important ideas you can take away from this session, what is still circling in your head, What are you still trying to understand? And lastly, what is something that squares or matches up with your thinking or values? As we close out, I just want to remind you again, my name is Casey Prince Harvey. I'm in the Office of Assessment and Standards. My email is included on this slide if you ever have any questions. This session was feedback for English 1 through 4. And also included on this slide, at the time of recording, we have one final spring webinar for high school on May 7th, which is on planning for instruction, bundling indicators in our 2024 ELA standards. And we also have office hours on April 22nd from 4:30 to 5:15 on AOR 7.1, determining a meeting. That concludes our webinar for today. And I thank you so much for taking part, and please reach out if you ever have any questions.